Good morning to those of you in the Washington, D.C. area, and good afternoon and good evening to those of us joining us from other parts of the world, including our featured speaker here today. I'm Suzanne Maloney. I'm Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution, and I'm honored and delighted to welcome you to today's on-the-record virtual public event featuring the Honorable Nicholas Burns, U.S. Ambassador to the People's Republic of China. Ambassador Burns is joining us virtually from Beijing. Ambassador Burns and the entire mission in Beijing are at the forefront of America's most consequential and complex bilateral relationship. Over the last decade, strategic competition between Washington and Beijing has grown sharper, areas of tension have intensified, and channels of communication have narrowed. Recognizing these trends, the Biden administration has called for setting guardrails to prevent stiff competition from spiraling into confrontation or conflict. Today's event offers an opportunity to take stock of how the U.S. policy is progressing. Similar to our Brookings conversation with National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan last November, today's event will open a window into how the U.S.-China relationship is faring in practice. With us to make sense of this moment is Ambassador Burns, one of America's most distinguished diplomats. He leads the U.S. mission in China that includes public servants from 47 U.S. government agencies and sub-agencies. He oversees the mission's interaction with China on the full range of political, security, economic, commercial, consular, and many other issues that shape this critical relationship. In his very distinguished career in the U.S. government, Ambassador Burns has served 6 presidents and 9 secretaries of state in very senior positions. Ambassador Burns is on public service leave from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, where he founded the school's Future of Diplomacy project and served as the Goodman Professor of Practice in Diplomacy and International Relations. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Ambassador Burns. I'm very pleased to turn the floor to my colleague, Armacost Chair and Senior Fellow at the Brookings Foreign Policy Program, Ryan Haas, who will moderate our discussion. Ryan, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Suzanne and Ambassador Burns. It's just a delight to have an opportunity to be with you today. I want to get your sense of the mood on the ground inside China, talk a bit about U.S. policy and where you see the U.S.-China relationship headed. But before we move into those topics, I'd love to get your sense as a 3-time ambassador of what is the role. Help our viewers understand how you conceptualize the role of ambassador. I think that we're working through some technical issues, but we will get online here shortly. We were speaking a moment ago, so Ambassador Burns is with us, and we will have him online very soon. As Suzanne mentioned, Ambassador Burns has had a distinguished career in the Foreign Service, in academia, and we're very fortunate that he's back serving our country again in China, leading Mission China, one of the biggest diplomatic missions in the world. And as we will talk about over the course of our discussion today, he's really played a pivotal role at major inflection points in America's diplomatic history over recent decades. And so it'll be a great opportunity to hear his reflections and how they relate to the current moment that we find ourselves in.
Ryan, I'm back. If you can see and hear me, I'm here in Beijing.
Wonderful. It's great to see you. I was just getting ready to ask, how do you conceptualize your role as ambassador?
Well, first, Ryan, I want to thank you for moderating this panel. You're so well known here in this mission as a veteran of this mission and so admired for your expertise in China. I'm really pleased to be with you, and thank you for your scholarship and your thoughtful analysis. And I just want to thank my friend Suzanne Maloney too. We served together, did a lot of work on Iran together many years ago, and I have huge respect for Suzanne. So I'm delighted to be with you and your audience. Good morning to everybody, and good evening to those people who might be watching here in China. Ryan, I'm going to give you an answer. It's going to sound very kind of classical and maybe even academic about the role of an ambassador here, but I think it does fit the times here. My principal responsibility is to represent President Biden and the entire Biden administration and to make sure that the government here in China, the People's Republic of China, understands our positions very clearly, understands our interests, understands what we can and cannot do in this very complicated relationship. And that's the job of any ambassador. That's the definition of an ambassador even, several centuries ago. But it also includes helping Washington to understand the strategy and the priorities and the mindset and the motivations and the culture, the political culture of China itself at a time of rapid change in China, a time of nationalism, a time when we've seen the PRC government highly aggressive in this region aggressive, frankly, towards a lot of our friends and allies in this region. So that's another important priority. And I guess a third would be this. Any ambassador, and I certainly take this very seriously, needs to connect with the people of the country to which you're accredited. It's hard to do here, certainly through social media because of Chinese restrictions on social media, because of censorship. But it's possible to do if you get out. Of course, we're living in a time of COVID. We're living in a time of lockdowns in Shanghai, lockdowns in Beijing. I've been here 3.5 months. I quarantined for 3 weeks when my wife and I did when I arrived. I haven't been able to break out of Beijing until last Sunday, when I was able to go by train to Wuhan, spend 3 days there. And it was a breath of fresh air to get out of this town and to see people there. I went to a university campus, met with students, met with the president of the University of Wuhan, which is one of their top 10 universities. That was a really good experience. We hadn't had an American ambassador on a university campus here in many years. Met with the governor of Hubei province, which is a very important province. Business-wise, economically, had a full discussion with him. Went to Catholic Mass. I'm Catholic, and so wanted to show support for freedom of religion, frankly, and see what church is like in this country. It was a really good opportunity to meet a lot of people. And so whenever the COVID storms pass, and who knows when that's going to be, I think zero COVID is with us for a long time. That's also part of the job of an ambassador, to get out and meet people, to represent the business community. And there's plenty to do in this country, as you know.
Right. Well, thank you for sharing with our viewers that appraisal of the role of ambassador. Now, how about for yourself and your current mission? What are your priorities?
Well, certainly my priority is to represent the president and his priorities. And he's clearly outlined them. You saw in the very successful trip that he made to this region. First, he hosted the ASEAN summit in Washington, and then his trip to South Korea. We have a strengthening relationship there. To Japan, I think probably historically strong relationship there. The Quad meeting, the inauguration of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Agreement. This has been really a 5-week period where the president has outlined the fundamentals of our strategy in the Indo-Pacific, I think, in a very effective way. So my strategy is to make sure the Chinese government understands this, the PRC government understands this, and to do what Secretary Blinken said in the speech he gave a couple of weeks ago at George Washington University. Help our country, of course, invest in our internal strength. And that's something that the administration is doing with a lot of determination. We need to be aligned to our partners and allies. And I think one of the big changes that President Biden has brought to the White House in his time in office is to reassert the primacy of our alliances. And out here in the Indo-Pacific, it's with Australia and Japan and South Korea, with the Philippines and Thailand, our treaty and security alliances with New Zealand, our priority partnerships with India, our strategic partnership with India and in the Indian Ocean region and the Western Pacific, and certainly very close friends, Indonesia and Singapore and many other countries in this region. We're part of that. We play that role here in Beijing diplomatically. But frankly, the third thing that Secretary Blinken said in his speech in describing the strategy of the administration, we want to invest in the strength of the country, align with our allies. We also need to compete with China. And this is really a time of competition in the economic and trade realm, competition for technological primacy, and that's critical in the 21st century, in the digital age, competition strategically in terms of our military power and positioning. And you'll recognize this from your own time here, Ryan. Competition, self-confidence, and American values, and our belief in freedom, and our belief in the rule of law, and the belief in our individual liberties that are the hallmark of our country. That's a very attractive part of America in many countries in this region. And so helping the United States to, if you will, conduct that competition in a way that is going to be effective in this country, in a way that's going to provide for stability at the same time. And of course, we want, as Secretary Austin said in his speech in Singapore last week, as Jake Sullivan and Secretary Blinken have also said in their public remarks, we want to do this in a way that we can limit the possibility of confrontation or conflict with China. We want to build in guardrails, as Secretary Austin talked about last week in Singapore, and we want stability in the relationship. That takes connecting with them. And so we've had two very important meetings this week. Secretary Austin in Singapore at Shangri-La with the Chinese Minister of Defense, and our National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, with Yang Jiechi in Luxembourg. They had a meeting, the two of them, on March 14th in Rome. They'd had a meeting last autumn as well. And now they've had a third meeting. That's a very important channel for us, as is, of course, the channel that Secretary Blinken has with Foreign Minister Wang Yi. And of course, our ultimate channel is the channel between our two presidents. So we're conducting intensive diplomacy out here on behalf of the United States, and we're very proud the men and women of our mission to do that.
Well, there are a lot of themes that I want to pick up as our conversation goes on that you just described, including the reaction to Secretary Blinken's speech. But I would like to just start where you finished, conducting intensive diplomacy, because my sense is that Mission China plays a very unique role now relative to previous periods, in part because China is largely closed. There is not the typical flow of senior level administration visitors, not the flow of senior congressional visitors. And it really, a lot falls on your shoulders and the shoulders of your mission to carry America's diplomacy forward inside China. And so given the unique circumstances that we find ourselves in, with China largely closed, I wondered if you could help us sort of understand a few aspects of life inside China right now. Because another feature is that there are fewer international journalists inside China relative to previous periods. And it just increases the importance of the role that you and your team are playing. So what's the mood like inside China right now? What are the top issues that are animating conversations and driving discussion inside China?
Well, you're right, it's an unusual time. We've not seen anything like this really in the past 50 years since President Nixon's trip to China in 1972, and then the normalization of our relationship in 1979. We've always had plenty of visitors, as you know. Every cabinet secretary in the United States would visit, American presidents would visit, lots and lots of business leaders would visit. We had lots of American students here. None of that's happening right now. We have very few American students in China. The Chinese are not giving out student visas. We have no visitors from the administration to Beijing. Certainly, we've had just a few administration officials, John Kerry, Wendy Sherman last summer in the Tianjin, southeast of here. The Chinese are they're not hosting visitors in Beijing. So it does put a lot of emphasis on our role here as the U.S. mission. As you said, Suzanne said, 47 U.S. government agencies out here to be the connecting point with the Chinese leadership. And we are doing that. We're carrying on an intensive dialogue, an intensive set of meetings with them. That's our job. And we'll do that to the best of our ability so that we can keep the governments talking and make sure that, for instance, this past week, we had two major meetings happen outside of China because they couldn't have happened in China. It's difficult to convince any of my colleagues in Washington to come here if I tell them that when they do it, they've got to quarantine for 14 days before they can have a single meeting. And I understand their unwillingness to do that. We need members of Congress to come out here. When I was undergoing confirmation last autumn, I was really struck by the degree of bipartisanship on many aspects of our relationship with China. That's a real strength for the United States. I want members of Congress from both parties to travel here. And we don't have the business leaders traveling here, the CEOs and chairmen of company that you would have had, by the multitudes in years past. So a very difficult time imposed by the zero COVID policy, by the lockdowns of Shenyang up north, Shanghai, of course, the closure of the port for a time of Shanghai for a time, and rolling lockdowns in Beijing. Just to give you an example, we were essentially locked down here for the better part of a month, couldn't leave the city environs, city limits, couldn't go to restaurants, for a time, couldn't even walk in the parks. They were all closed. The city opened up for about 5 days, and then there was just, I think, 60 or 70 infections at the end of last week, and things began to close down again. So I think we're going to have to live with this for a long time. My own assumption is that we'll see the continuation of zero COVID probably into the beginning months of 2023. That's what the Chinese government is signaling. And it does put a premium on our ability in this particular mission of the United States, our diplomatic mission here in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenyang, and Wuhan, to be on point for the United States. And so we're working hard at that.
And how is it working for the business community? I know that you, in your job, you've made a real priority of engaging with American businesses operating in China. But as you described, it's very difficult to travel and there's obstructions to supply chains. So what effect is it having, if any, on business decisions by U.S. companies in China?
It's had a major impact. The Shanghai lockdown in particular, given the importance of that city and that region in terms of industrial production, is where a lot of the American big manufacturing plants are located. If you think of Ford and Tesla and GM, to give you a couple of examples in that region. We figured before COVID, there were about 40,000 American citizens, private American citizens living in the Shanghai, what we consider the Shanghai Consular District, that we administer from our Consulate General. And I think, we don't have exact numbers, but lots and lots of those people have gone home, and in conversations with the Germans, with the French and others, the Indians, the Japanese, a lot of their nationals, their private business people have gone home as well because life's really been hard for them. It's, of course, the major part of this has been just disruption to the supply chain. We feel that back in the United States because of the labyrinth of the supply chain throughout China, supplier parts that come into those big manufacturing plants. And that's interrupted international commerce. And of course, Shanghai is one of the critical, if not the critical port in the world for the global supply chain. And you've seen the interruption and the consequent economic problems all around the world, including food security problems. And so we're quite cognizant of the need. I think the Chinese government is quite cognizant of the need to try to get back to a situation of normalcy. What we're hearing from the American business community and from the European business community, and there are two interesting reports coming out from the American Chamber of Commerce and the European Chamber of Commerce. This is just too important a market for countries to leave. And so we don't see a lot of companies, we don't see a lot of companies leaving lock, stock, and barrel. But from the results that I've read and the conversations I've had with lots of business leaders here, I think there's a hesitancy to invest in future obligations until they can see the end of this. And as I say, I think most people don't see the end of this in terms of the restrictions imposed by zero COVID until 2023. And a lot will also depend, Ryan, on the direction of the People's Republic of China's economic policy. You'll remember last summer and last autumn, the backlash against the tech community by the government here. There's been a back and forth quality over the last 2 months or so. Are they cracking down? Or are they not? Are they more status or are they more market oriented? And I think that the muddying of the waters about the future clarity of what their economic strategy is has also, I think, just given people pause here. We have a very important economic relationship with China, $650 billion in two-way trade last year, about 1,100 American companies operating in this country, and many, many thousands more trading. And so obviously, given China's role in the global economy, given our own, there's a real premium on trying to see a return to normalcy. But I think that's going to be months into the future.
That's fascinating. I know that you've spent time consulting with your counterparts from Germany, Japan, and elsewhere who also have a major business presence in China. Are you hearing a similar story from them about how their companies are approaching the China market?
Well, we're in touch with, obviously I'm in touch with a lot of my colleagues from the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere here, and I can't speak for them. But if you look at these major trendline reports where these two chambers have interviewed hundreds of companies here, I think the trend lines are pretty clear. And I explained, I think, what some of the major takeaways have been. China, as you know, Ryan, very well, the extraordinary performance of this economy over the last 40 years was built on rational economic decision making, on careful planning. And of course, that's obviously what the government here wants to do. But we see a strengthening of the party. We hear different voices. And obviously, it's been a difficult time for the PRC government, the Chinese people, having to live with a considerable lockdown in many different cities. At one point, of course, Wuhan for 76 days at the very beginning of the crisis 2.5 years ago. Xi'an, Shenyang, when I first got here, was under lockdown. Our consulate general up there had a wonderful leader, Nancy Abella, who pulled us through that crisis up there. And Shanghai was really the crucible of it. And at one point, we had 80 American consular officers between our consulate in Shanghai and our embassy in Beijing working round-the-clock shifts just to take phone calls from American citizens who wanted to get out, needed water and food, needed medical care. These are real-life human dramas that we took very seriously. It's our fundamental responsibility, if you think about it, of an American embassy and consulate, is to represent is to help the American people here. And we were working around the clock for a good month on that. So it's been quite a ride since my arrival 3.5 months ago. And again, we're a full service operation and we're trying to help the American business community, American citizens get through this as best we can.
Well, I appreciate the efforts of you and your team on that. If I could, you mentioned Secretary Blinken's speech a moment ago. I'd love to ask you about that. How has the speech been received broadly, and also how have your official counterparts in Beijing reacted to it?
Well, you know how it is here. So when I thought it was a very fine speech. It was comprehensive in its analysis of the situation we're in this complicated relationship that we have, but also its prescription and its clarity. We talked about at the beginning of this interview. We're going to invest in the strength of the country because that's what we have to do in America. We're going to promote our alliances and partnerships, align, and then we're going to compete where we have to compete, and we'll engage, as Secretary Blinken said, and there are a number of areas we can engage and should engage with the PRC government. But the story is we were called in and lots of complaints about the speech, unfortunately, and I was really disappointed in this, not surprised, but disappointed. We put the speech on Weibo and WeChat, and it was censored in about 2.5 hours, just taken away. But it was interesting. In that 2.5 hours, we had lots of people in this country looking at that speech. And then 3 days later, we put it back on Weibo and WeChat. It was censored in about 20 minutes. So that's the game that they play. And, we don't censor the president of China's speeches or the foreign minister of China's speeches in the United States. I mean, God forbid, we would never do that. Never could do that. Don't have the capacity to do that. It's against our values. And so but I've heard a lot of interesting comments in private discussions, mainly with people outside the government, obviously, because people inside the government are going to be very stolid in representing the government's views. I think people noticed that there was an honesty in that speech. We are in a competitive framework, the two governments, in all the areas that I mentioned at the beginning: economics, technology, security, values. And Secretary Blinken was very clear about where that competition is and how it needs to be prosecuted, why it's in our interest to make sure that we succeed in the competition. But what did he also say? We're not in a Cold War. We're not trying to change China. That was a very important line in the speech. And he also outlined a number of areas where we can engage and should engage, and frankly are. Climate change, where John Kerry, I think, has done a really, really constructive job of working with his Chinese counterpart. Look at the Glasgow Declaration that they issued together at the end of the Glasgow Climate Conference last autumn. We have a major, I think, common interest in working on counter-narcotics. As you know, Ryan, a lot of the precursor chemicals that go into the fabrication of fentanyl, the synthetic opioid fentanyl, are shipped not by the Chinese government, but by Chinese black market companies into the narco traffickers in Mexico and Central America. And that's where the fentanyl is produced. And we lost 110,000 Americans in a 12-month period between 2021 and 2022, and 70% of those deaths were from fentanyl. So, I've approached the government here and asked them to work with us to make sure that we can interrupt the flow of those precursor chemicals. They can interrupt the flow of the precursor chemicals into Mexico and Central America. The government here took a positive action 3 years ago. They classified fentanyl as a controlled substance. They've created a database to try to track the flow of precursor chemicals. Those are positive steps. So I think, we would want to work with the government on counter narcotics. It's so important to our country. And certainly we're working in agriculture pretty well. Last year, American farmers and ranchers sold $38 billion worth of American agricultural products to China. 1/5 of all American agricultural exports go to China. Soybeans alone, $14.1 billion worth of soybeans sold by American farmers to China. This is something that China absolutely needs. It's something very important for our farm and ranch community and economy back in the United States. So there are areas where we can engage. It takes goodwill, it takes connectivity, and it takes a two-way street. And Secretary Blinken was clear about that in his speech. So, I'm giving you a very long-winded answer. I apologize, but I think it's a very important question. We are in a largely competitive mode here, and we've made no secret of that in our government. But there are areas where we ought to be engaging with each other, and that's one of my jobs, along with a lot of my colleagues in Washington, is to find those areas and try to push those areas forward to resolution. Public health is another area. We were very disappointed and remain disappointed that the Chinese government was not transparent with the rest of the world at the beginning of the pandemic. The WHO is now on its study and just issued an interim report in the early part of June about its findings. We have encouraged the PRC government, the People's Republic government here, to work with the WHO to share the data that they have about what happened at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. That's important too. And so, there are about 1,000 issues that we're working on throughout the spectrum of this relationship.
Another issue that Secretary Blinken touched on was students, the fact that the United States continues to welcome Chinese students. In your impression, being on the ground, is there still a strong appetite amongst Chinese students to study in the United States?
I think there is. Pre-COVID, we figured we had about 375,000 students in our universities, in graduate school, and even some in high schools, and private schools in the United States. I don't know what the accurate figures are now, but last summer we issued from this mission, our mission in China, about 100,000 student visas. I went down to our visa line a couple of weeks ago and watched our young consular officers in action. There's a big long line of people, of young people here in China applying for student visas. We'll know in a month or two what the overall number is. It'll be a very healthy number. I just don't know whether it's going to approach last year's or not. It's too early to tell. But that does tell me that that a lot of young Chinese understand the importance of education in our country, the opportunities they have. That was another important part of Secretary Blinken's speech, that we want young Chinese to study in the United States. We have a line here. If people don't tell the truth in their visa application, or if we think a student applicant is connected to the civil military fusion complex here, they're not going to get a visa. But that's a very small minority of the visa applicants. And we're granting lots of visas. And I think it's very healthy for our students to be studying together. So I was in Wuhan on Monday afternoon at the University of Wuhan. As I said, we hadn't had access to a university campus here in a long time. I met with 20 students for an hour and a half. They were humanities majors, economic majors, computer science majors. I taught at, as you know, at the Kennedy School for the last 12 years. They seemed a lot like our students there. Really eager to learn, really eager to work with other students around the world. And so this is healthy for the relationship. We don't want to be in a relationship where we're completely cut off from each other. It's not healthy. It's not good for the long term of the relationship. And we certainly want young Chinese to understand our country up close and the values of our country up close.
I'm really happy to hear you say that. It makes me recall a comment that Wang Jisoo made recently. He's an eminent scholar of the United States inside China, and he said, "I'll believe that the United States is in decline when there is no longer a long line outside of the U.S. visa application window," which I thought was a pretty powerful statement and rebuttal to some of the assertions that are made occasionally inside China about American decline. But if I could, Ambassador, I wanted to ask about something else. You recently made a comment that the United States-China relationship has hit its lowest point since 1972. And that obviously drew attention in the United States, both for its observation, but also for the tactical utility of calling the bottom in the relationship. So why did you make that statement?
I think it's a true statement. I think it's a true reflection of where we are. It's an honest assessment of where we are. It doesn't mean the bottom has fallen out of the relationship, but if you track, I mean, you're a scholar of China and plus a diplomat, you track our relationships since President Nixon's visit 50 years ago this year. We had periods of intense involvement in the 1970s and early 1980s in every respect with the government of Deng Xiaoping. President Clinton, an administration in which I served as a Foreign Service officer, had a strategic commitment to help China come into the world and join the international system. President George W. Bush, another administration I served in, thought about China. You remember the phrase of our Deputy Secretary of State at the time, Bob Zellick, we want China to be a stakeholder in the international system. President Obama was dedicated to that. So we now have a relationship where I think the Chinese have produced, right, by the behavior of the government here in Beijing, a lot of concern in this region. Think of the aggressiveness of the People's Republic government against India along their long border in the Himalayas over the last 3 or 4 years. Think of the bullying of both the Philippines and Vietnam in the Paracels and Spratly Islands, the South China Sea. Think of the conflict that the PRC has with Japan in the East China Sea. In the economic realm, the dumping, the use of state subsidies, the unfair competition that they subject our companies to. I think this has produced a counterreaction, both in our own country, by both Republican and Democratic administrations, and in the parliaments and the government ministries of many of our allies and partners in this region. So it is a very unusual time. And I don't think we've had a relationship in the last 50 years that is similar to this in the degree of intensity of that competition. But I think we have a view that if we wage that competition peacefully, and of course we want to do it peacefully, but effectively and with determination on our side, and if we try to engage the government here in those areas that you and I have already talked about, the United States is going to be better off. And our position in this region is going to be stronger as a result of this. And so that's what we're determined to do.
Yeah, I think you made a very important point. It's not just the United States that's experiencing a strained relationship with China right now. If you survey many countries around the world, in Europe and in Asia and South Asia, there is a pattern to the relationships that exist with China. And a lot of it traces back to the menu of issues that you just described. But when I talk with Chinese counterparts, they often say, no, that's not the case. What really is the case is the United States' anxiety about a shrinking gap in relative power. That as China rises and the United States either stagnates or declines, the gap shrinks, and that causes the United States to become more aggressive in seeking to suppress China's rise in order to preserve its privileged position. So why is that line of argument wrong?
I don't think it's accurate. I don't buy it. I think it's an excuse. I've heard the same argument from people in the government here and people close to the government. And it's wrong because just look at the behavior of the United States in recent years. President Obama worked very effectively with the government here on climate change, the Paris Agreement that he worked out, led with President Xi Jinping. Think about the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement of July 2015, worked out with China as one of the countries on our side of the negotiating table against the Iranians. And look at the degree of economic engagement that the United States government in the past, as well as our private sector, have had. We're not acting like a country that's trying to keep China down. I think what's changed is the newly aggressive behavior of the Chinese government, of the PRC government over the last 5 to 10 years. And you've seen a counter reaction to that, not just in our government, but as you quite rightly said, in Europe. Think of the poor state of relations between the European Union and China. The April 1st summit was it was not a resounding success. It was, in fact, the opposite of that. Look at the strengthening and the depth of concern in Japan, for instance. And so I really think that an honest assessment would say they've been too aggressive in too many areas. We haven't talked about Taiwan, but the Secretary Austin, I think, put it very clearly in his speech. The aggressive posture, the aggressive language that we heard last weekend from the Chinese Minister of Defense. And we are for a peaceful resolution of that dispute. And the People's Republic of China has committed itself for many decades to a peaceful resolution. And obviously that's the standard that should apply here. So I just don't agree with that argument that you and I have heard very frequently from people.
Well, I appreciate your candor. I share your view on that. But I do have to acknowledge, sitting in Washington, that there is a fair degree of pessimism right now about whether there is space or opportunity to improve the U.S. China relationship, at least in the near term. And I wanted to get your sense of, do you think that the degree of pessimism that you see in Washington is founded, justified, or do you think that there are opportunities that are being underappreciated?
Well, it's certainly not a time of optimism, but I think we have to be realistic. The relationship is what it is right now. As we have said since the beginning of this administration, we are in a competitive framework right now. And so that competition need not be confrontation. That competition can be carried out in a mature way by both sides, in a way that does not affect the security of this region. And that's the responsibility of both governments. And we, of course, take that very seriously. We talked earlier about building in guardrails to make sure that there's no possibility, or we drive down the possibility of an unintentional conflict. And so that's very serious, and we take it very seriously, and we're working at that. But, I know that there are people inside the government here who don't like the word competition, but that is a word that accurately describes where we are. But the engagement word, in the limited areas, but they're important areas that we talked about, that's also part of this relationship. So I think, to be realistic, we can't get our hopes up too high. We know that this is going to play out over a long term. The president's talked about the fact that this is a critical decade for the United States, for us to strengthen ourselves at home, for us to re-engage with allies, and for us to put our best foot forward here in the competition and in those areas where we engage. And I feel, as ambassador here, I have very clear instructions from the president, from the Secretary of State, Secretary Blinken, from our entire national leadership. And so our job is to carry out those instructions, is to be on point here, is to understand what's happening here, so we can gauge our policy appropriately. And we're hard at work at that.
Well, you were in a important role when September 11th happened, and the United States and China were able to find each other in that moment. The global financial crisis, the United States and China were able to find each other and have a certain degree of coordination that helped resuscitate the global economy. On climate issues, the United States and China were able to work together to bring about the Paris Climate Accord. There's been a break in that pattern, though. With COVID-19 and now with Ukraine, the United States and China really have not been able to find each other in common directions or common cause, coordinated efforts. As you look to challenges that are approaching us, whether it's food security, Iran nuclear issues, others, do you think that there's still muscle memory available for the United States and China to find each other and if not cooperate, work in a common direction on parallel tracks?
We'll see. We would certainly hope so. It remains to be seen. We're going to have to see how this all plays out in the next couple of years, maybe the next couple of decades ultimately. I think the big test, Ryan, will be, can we continue to work together and with the rest of the world on climate change? That is an existential challenge for the entire world. China is about 28% of global emissions. We're well below that, but we are the two leading carbon emitters. And we are the leaders, along with Japan and the European Union and others, in this major global challenge. And so if our two governments can work together on that, then we'll have proven that despite the competition between us, we can engage in big issues. There's the issue of food security, which is so important to the world right now, given the disruptions in global supply chains, given the war, Russia's brutal war in Ukraine. And those are two. I mentioned the fentanyl issue. It's not a global problem, but it's critical for the United States and it's critical for China to play a role in the resolution of that. So, we're testing these areas and we're hopeful that we might make some progress, but we understand, we're realistic as well. These things sometimes take time in this very complicated relationship. So we need to be steely-eyed about things. And I think, as I reflect on 9/11 and even the period after the 2008 financial crisis, it's very important for the United States to lead. And I'm so proud of our president. I'm proud to serve in this administration because the president has brought us back to the World Health Organization, to the climate change effort, to UNESCO, but more importantly, strengthen the NATO alliance, strengthen our Indo-Pacific alliances here with the countries that I mentioned, and put out some challenging ideas that can unite a lot of countries, from a democracy summit to the COVID summit to the this nascent, but I think very important Indo-Pacific economic framework. I think countries are responding very positively, and I'm closely in touch with my allied ambassadorial colleagues here from all these countries. We talk all the time. I think they're reassured that the United States is back in the game as the international leader. And as I reflected, particularly on 9/11, that's so important for us. We're still the largest economy, we're still the most powerful military, and we're the leading democracy in the world. And so countries look to us for leadership. I've been out of government quite a while, and it's been really reassuring for me, just as an American, to feel that sense of confidence in our country out here in the Indo-Pacific, not necessarily in the government to which I'm accredited, that sense of confidence, but certainly in our allies. And so that's a very strong point. And I'd say that self-confidence is going to be important for us. And we have a president and cabinet self-confident about our future and about who we are and what we're doing in the world. That's important, that the American people, despite all of our troubles at home, this is a difficult time at home, that we feel self-confident about the role we're playing in the world.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important point. You mentioned Russia a moment ago. If my memory serves me correctly, your arrival in China coincided with the escalation of tensions and the invasion by Russia of Ukraine. How have you watched the China-Russia relationship evolve during the time that you've been on the ground in China?
Well, we're watching it closely. That February 4th statement on the morning of the day the Olympics began between President Putin and President Xi Jinping, that was a weighty statement. I think it was a wake-up call for a lot of people around the world to see that these two authoritarian powers have a very different view of how the international order should be shaped. We have a very specific view. The international order should be protected, and the democratic basis, the human rights concerns, the freedom that's embedded in the founding documents of the international order post-World War II, they're precious and they have to be preserved. And I think it's been invigorating to see how many countries are rallying to that. So, we're watching that relationship closely. Of course, we're watching, and we were very clear in the Biden administration about the inadmissibility of China supporting Russia militarily in this war. We've not seen that happen. I think you've heard that consistently from White House spokespeople, even in the last couple of days. We've not seen that, but certainly we're watching that very closely. And what I'm feeling is a lot of countries in this part of the world wanting to see the United States do what we're doing, strengthen our relationship with ASEAN, with our treaty allies, have an economic component, which we have, of course, to our policy out here, and have a very realistic view of our relationship with the People's Republic of China.
Yeah. Well, I have so many more questions that I want to ask you, but our audience is streaming in with questions of their own, and I want to give them an opportunity to pose questions directly to you. So I will convey them on their behalf.
Sure.
But before I do so, I would just note that you played a pivotal role in the White House during the fall of the Berlin Wall. You played a pivotal role in the government after September 11th. I think that it gives me comfort to know that you are on the front lines of the most consequential relationship that we have at a very pivotal moment today in the U.S. China relationship. So I just, before we move on, I did want to acknowledge that point and express my appreciation for you being in Beijing at this time. BUN Liu asked, how was your very effective social media campaign in China being received? Are you getting uptake for visiting the Forbidden City and engaging with Chinese people? What's the reaction?
Well, in addition to my work, obviously my primary job is to be a connecting point for our government with the PRC government. Obviously, we want to connect with the Chinese people. So my wife and I, Libby and I, we're intrigued by Chinese culture. So we had a fascinating visit to the Forbidden City, and of course, we put that out in social media. My wife's an avid gardener. We went to the botanical gardens. They have a world-class botanical gardens out just on the outskirts of Beijing. In Wuhan the other day, just to interact with students on a university campus, to speak to the governor of Hubei province. He and I didn't agree on everything. In fact, we noted the large number of issues where we disagreed, but we agreed on climate change, for instance. So I think it's very important that the Chinese people have an accurate view of who we are and what we stand for, and our genuine interest in keeping the doors open in terms of the interaction of our peoples. And we do that through students. There's too little of it right now because of COVID. A lot of our foundations and NGOs can't operate here because of COVID. And, frankly, we want to see more American journalists here. That's a big part of who we are, freedom of the press. And there are too few American journalists here. So we are carrying out a social media campaign. We're on Weibo, WeChat, every social media platform we could find. And it's a challenge, but it's something that we're determined to continue.
We have a question from Gordon Davis, who's retired from the National Democratic Institute. He asked, how concerned should we be about Taiwan? How are your interactions with your Chinese counterparts on this issue?
I think Secretary Austin expressed our concerns publicly, and as Secretary Blinken did in his speech 2 weeks ago. Our policy has not changed. We are for a peaceful outcome to the conflict across the Taiwan Strait. And of course, we are concerned about the level of the increased decibel levels of the PRC rhetoric against Taiwan. We're concerned by the harassment on the sea and in the air of Taiwan by the PLA. China committed to a peaceful resolution of this dispute. It has for decades. And I think that's the standard to which the government here in Beijing has to be held accountable. This is a very active discussion that we have underway privately, and we'll keep most of it private. But certainly publicly, this is what we have to say, and this is what you've heard our cabinet officers and our president say very consistently: peaceful resolution of this dispute. There is no reason to resort to the force of arms or to intimidation or coercion here against Taiwan.
And another hot button issue is North Korea. We have a question from Yoonjung Cho from Voice of America. She asked, why is China vetoing UN Security Council resolutions on North Korea after the recent tests?
We were disappointed. I think our ambassador, our great ambassador, my friend Linda Thomas Greenfield, was clear about that. Very disappointed by the veto by both China and Russia over a Security Council resolution that should have passed, given the actions of the North Korean regime. And so, we want to work with China closely on this. We have a conversation with the PRC government. But there are times when the international community has to speak. And for decades now, the United Nations Security Council has been able to put together votes to clearly call out the North Korean regime when they've acted in such a way, either with ballistic missile tests or in the past nuclear tests, that are inimical to peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula. We have an ally, the Republic of Korea, a very important ally to ours, to the United States. And obviously, we're going to maintain our commitments to that ally. We want to see peace. And we hope that the government in Beijing will join us in that effort to produce peace in the Korean Peninsula.
We have a question from Brian Klein at Ridgepoint Global. He asked about Hong Kong issues. There's been an exodus of expats from Hong Kong over the past year. How do you see this affecting the business environment, and how do you see the business environment in Hong Kong developing going forward?
Well, one thing to note, the United States has an independent consulate in Hong Kong, has had for a very long time, will continue to have. And so Hong Kong is not part of my responsibilities here. I have colleagues in the American Foreign Service who are in our consulate general there. But obviously the United States is extremely disappointed at what's happened in Hong Kong, let's say dated back to 2019, when so many people demonstrated peacefully in the streets of Hong Kong. I was actually in China as a private citizen during that time, watched from Beijing, Shanghai, Xi'an, as I was traveling around China, my wife and I, those extraordinary outpouring of democracy in the streets of Hong Kong. And to see the result now is very disappointing for all of us. And we've been very clear about our views on the national security law, on the repudiation of the rights of the people of Hong Kong. We have an active human rights agenda here. It concerns Hong Kong. It concerns Tibet. It concerns Xinjiang. It concerns the genocide against the Uyghur population. I met with over 150 American companies 2 days ago, along with colleagues from Washington, from the Department of Homeland Security, and from our CPB officials in Washington. And we took the American companies through the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, passed by the Congress last December, signed by the president, which goes into effect next week on June 21st. And we want to make sure that American companies understand that law, which is very specific and which sets a very high standard about making sure that anything produced or sold or transferred from Xinjiang to the rest of the world does not employ slave labor. It's a very high bar to prove that it isn't. And we really want and need the American business community to be fully understanding of that law and its requirements. And we've got a week to go. We'll be meeting with more American businesses to go through that. So our human rights agenda here is part of our tradition, part of American interests in the world and values in the world. And you saw Secretary Blinken, the president, Jake Sullivan, and all of us have talked about how important that is.
And how have the conversations on human rights evolved over time? Is it an issue that you're able to actively engage your counterparts on today?
We do. We don't come to any agreement, but we're very specific. We talk about people who are being held unjustly. We talk about Americans who are being held unjustly. We talk about people on trial. We're very specific in terms of Tibet and Xinjiang and Hong Kong and others here in China who are being held, we think, unfairly, detained, imprisoned for speaking their mind, exercising rights that in most of the rest of the world are fully normal and rights that make life special. And those rights have disappeared here largely. So this is an important part of our agenda.
Yeah. We have a question from Joe at California State University, who asked if you see the current trend lines extending into the future and China becoming increasingly closed, or if this is a temporary aberration due to COVID-related issues.
I think it's a very intelligent question. It's a key question here. Another thing that Secretary Blinken has been saying is we're not seeking to decouple our economy, to untangle it somehow, the millions of threads of interaction from that of China, but we have seen China pull back. There's a big movement here led by the government for sustainability, secure their own supply chains. President Xi has been saying that Chinese rice should be in Chinese rice bowls. Part of it is understandable. They want to have food security. That's understandable here, just as we do, and other people around the world do. Part of it, I think, is maybe a reaction to what they're seeing. Russia's paid a great penalty for what it's done in Ukraine in terms of the sanctions that the European Union and Japan and the United States and many other countries have levied on Russia. And so we see signs of the People's Republic government pulling back, that's for sure. There are areas where the United States for a long time, if you think has not wanted to see continue, you think about the restrictions we've placed under CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, over many administrations to restrict the ability of Chinese investors to invest in technologies or companies critical to our national security. So we're taking appropriate measures to rebuild some of our own supply chains. But in general, there's a lot of American trade with China in areas that don't impinge upon our national security. I think if anyone in the relationship is pulling back, it might be the Chinese right now, the Chinese government. So that is something to watch. It's unclear to me, frankly, whether this is going to continue post-COVID. I think the government here understands that a lot of their wealth and future prosperity depends on interaction with the rest of the world. They're the world's largest manufacturer and largest exporter. And they're inextricably bound up with the rest of the world. And they've made a lot of intelligent decisions over the last 20 years. We don't agree with all of those decisions, but they've worked for China. And so let's see what they end up doing, but we're clear-eyed about the challenge.
Ambassador, you've mentioned several times during our time together that it's important for competition not to veer into conflict. We know that President Biden raised the importance of establishing guardrails during his previous interactions with President Xi. How are those conversations developing?
Well, there's not a lot I can say, obviously, about those conversations. You'll appreciate that, Ryan. They're private conversations. We prefer to keep them private for the time being. But I can tell you that you heard Secretary Austin talk about it in his speech. You know that our National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, have been focused on that. They'll continue to be focused on it. And I certainly am from my position here in Beijing. And it's important. We talk about competition. It doesn't mean confrontation. It doesn't mean collision. Far from it. We don't want that in this relationship. We want a peaceful, stable relationship. We have a lot of differences that need to be carried out. That's the competition part of it. But both of us have an interest in peace in this region and between us. And you've heard it from our president. And we're clear-eyed about clear in his instructions to us that that's the kind of relationship that he wants us to help produce for the United States. And we're determined to do that.
We have a question from Kristen Schur-Kupfer from the University of Trier. And her question is about the American dream. Does the American dream still have purchase in China? Is it still a source of inspiration on the ground in China?
Well, it's hard to generalize about it. It's a very good question. I thank you for it. It's hard to generalize about a country of 1.4 billion people. But my sense is, we get out and talk to a lot of people here, and we've got 5 different units of the 4 consulates and the embassy throughout a major part of the country here. I think, getting beyond the competition here and the disagreements that we have government to government, I think there is a respect for the United States, for what we've accomplished as a country, for our standard of living, for our successful economy, for, frankly, in private conversations, our democratic freedoms, for the way we acquit ourselves in the world. And so I think there's a window here where Americans, if we talk respectfully, we want to be respectful with the Chinese people and with the government too. We can make some inroads to make sure that the Chinese people understand who we are. That's really why I went to Wuhan. Most of my interactions were with private Chinese in all walks of life, business and students, and meeting the bishop or the Catholic bishop of Wuhan, things like that, and just letting them know that we're for peace and we're for a peaceful relationship. But obviously, we're also going to stand up for American values and American interests. And I think people, understand that. It's hard for me to generalize because it's also a time of intense nationalism here, and it's fueling sometimes the self-confidence that we see and maybe even the aggressiveness of the Chinese government. And so, we have to be mindful of that as well. But I think breaking through, connecting people to people is a very important part of what we want to do in this country as guests.
Well, Ambassador, you've been incredibly generous with your time and your insights and your thoughts. I think that our audience has been enriched by the opportunity to hear your on-the-ground perspective. It's very clear to me the importance that you've associated with having self-confidence and a steady, principled, firm, clear approach to this relationship. And I just want to thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. I also want to give you the final word before we wrap up.
Well, the final word is to say thank you, Ryan, to you, and thank you to everybody who joined this webinar today. I just think I think we're on the right track in the administration's policy towards China. I think we're on the right track because it's a policy that is designed to last well into the future. If you think about investing in the country, building our alliances, competing with the People's Republic of China's government, and then engaging where we have to engage for our interests and global interests. This is a policy that we need to have for this decade into the next decade. And if you have the framework right, and if you have goodwill on our side, and we do have our goodwill on our side to be a productive partner, as well as a competitor, I think we've got the right ingredients for a long-term, successful and effective strategy out here in this region. And so we feel good about where we are, but we're also cognizant of many, many challenges ahead. So thank you, Ryan, for this. Thank you for your scholarship. And I read what you write and value it very much. And I hope that when the COVID storms disappear, the clouds disappear, we will see you out here.
I look forward to that. Thank you so much, Ambassador Burns. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.